it was incredible to me that this story, both incredible and totally believable, that this story has not been widely covered, or that there's been very few questions actually asked of Evgeny Lebedev and his father, and his ownership of the Evening Standard and the Independent. What do you think he wants with them? Is it like a profit, or is there something more sinister at work here?
Well, that's a very good question, Josh. And we don't know the answer, but it's an important question to ask, and far too many people in the mainstream media establishment, etc., have not had the wit to ask that question. And so, for people who haven't watched Compromat, and it's on the Byline TV website, have a go. I think it costs £2 to watch, which is less than the price of a coffee in London. What it looks at is the strange, funny, peculiar relationship between Boris Johnson and the Lebedevs. Now, the one you may have heard more about is Evgeny Lebedev, who is Baron Siberia. And there's a hint there in the name that something's slightly amiss. So he's now a member of the House of Lords, which is still part of our parliament. And he's a lawmaker, therefore he has the power to say what he wants and to vote whatever he wants. And what's interesting about him is not him. In fact, he's more of child than man. He once got an interview with President Lukashenko, the tyrant of Belarus, and the BBC, he managed to get this, sort of BBC went along and filmed it, and they sent a friend of mine, Natalia Antelova, who was kind of reporting on Lebedev's reporting, a rather strange, peculiar thing. And at one point, Yevgeny Lebedev, the man who is now Baron Siberia, asks Lukashenko what's his view on group sex, which is weird and peculiar. And even Lukashenko was, what are you talking about? So this is a very weird playboy. But his father, Alexander Lebedev, was a KGB spy in London from 1988 to 1992. And the Ukrainians say that the KGB is like Hotel California. You can check out any time you want, but you can never, ever leave. So, and by the way, Putin says this. The Russians call secret police, the people who were in the KGB, new name FSB, there are other organizations, but let's just call it the Russian secret police. And the nickname for them is the Cheka, which comes from the Extraordinary Commission, which is what Lenin's secret police was called back in 1917, the Cheka. And what Putin has said is, once a Chekist, always a Chekist. So you can't get a higher authority on the Russian secret police than Vladimir Putin. And therefore, that raises an enormous question about Alexander Lebedev. Now, let's remember that when Boris Johnson celebrated his December 2019 election victory, he did so at the house of Alexander Lebedev in London. And because it was Alexander's 60th birthday. So this is a very, very funny, peculiar relationship. After the Salisbury poisonings, Boris Johnson went to a NATO meeting in Brussels. And then somehow he ended up at Alexander Lebedev's palazzo in Umbria in Italy. Gorgeous place, magnificent swimming pool, blah, 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 blah. And this, at the time, knowing what was inside NATO's collective mind about what response they would do to the Salisbury poisonings, was probably the number one intelligence goal for the Russian secret state. And Boris goes and stays in a palazzo owned by a former KGB colonel. Hello? What's that about? It's very, very concerning. Now, my friend Christopher Steele, who remember was the former MI6 officer who was in charge of what we call the Russia House, which is or what they call the Russia House, or basically the part of MI6 that looks at Russia. He was in charge of it. Then he left, and he set up as in corporate intelligence, doing reports on people doing due diligence, and he did a report on Donald Trump. And this is the famous Trump dossier. So Christopher Steele says that nobody with a proper degree of power has properly investigated another question, which is who paid for Brexit. Now, yes, for example, there has been some question marks about Britain's biggest political donation ever. That's by Aaron Banks to essentially leave the Leave campaign. And there's an awful lot of money, £8 million from Aaron Banks to the Leave campaign. There was a lot of reporting, and I did quite a bit of it, questioning where the money came from.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've quoted you in my first book because I covered this. I wrote a book called Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. So yeah.
But what happened? I should look out for that book. What happened was that that the Electoral Commission investigated and the National Crime Agency investigated, and they both cleared Aaron Banks, and Aaron Banks has denied any wrongdoing, etc., etc. So we're all clear about that. There is no story. But Christopher Steele says that neither the National Crime Agency or the Electoral Commission is competent to do this kind of investigation. I.e., you have to have the full resources of the National Security Agency, the people in Cheltenham who kind of can break enciphered emails, etc., and MI5 and MI6. They're the people who can properly investigate this question: who paid for Brexit? And that hasn't happened. Now, the reason it hasn't happened is because the Conservative Party, who are in power, have not asked for it to happen. So the question is not, did the Russian secret state help push the vote for Brexit, as they did for Trump? We all know about that because the Americans have properly investigated it. The question in Britain is, who paid for Brexit? Did the Russian secret state help the Brexit campaign? And the answer to that question is no, according to the Electoral Commission, and no, according to the National Crime Agency, although that it's a very, very narrow investigation. And then Christopher Steele says, neither of these two bodies are up for that question. They're not good enough to answer it, to do a proper investigation. Then you have within that, you have the Lebedevs, father and the son, KGB spy and playboy, and Boris Johnson goes to their parties. Now, their parties are bunga bunga parties. Anything goes. Boys, girls, drugs. I'm not talking aspirin or paracetamol. The Lebedevs deny this. I'm being careful and I'm being fair. The Lebedevs deny this, and they say that essentially people like me are Russophobic. I would reply, that's entirely untrue. I love Russia. I love Russian literature, Russian drinking, Russian Russia, the whole thing. I've been in love with it most of my adult life. There's a real problem now for people like me because I do not think that the Russian opposition has been good enough in terms of standing up to the barbarity of the war. Obviously, someone I regard as a friend, Alexei Navalny, he's in prison. So is Vladimir Kurtz, I've forgotten his surname, whose full surname, I know he's been poisoned twice. He's in prison. Ilya Yashin, he's in prison. And the others who stood up to Putin, Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Estimarova, Boris Nemtsov, poisoned, then shot. So I understand how difficult it is to protest, but nevertheless, I'm upset about that the other Russia I believe in has not stood up to Putin so far. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. So I would say to the Lebedevs, I'm not a Russophobe, that's foolish. But there is a question mark about their relationship with Boris Johnson. And that's something which remains a question mark, and it's an unanswered question. The answer provided by the NCA and the Electoral Commission was partial, not complete.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.